a lot of times enterprises stick with what they've had for years or what the last CTO, CIO said to put in there. So what we find is we say, why? They say, well, we have waves connecting these two data centers, and this is the workload that we do. And we go, okay, well, why do you have that wave? Because it's really long, or it's not performing, and there's a reason. And so they say, well, that's kind of what we've always had.
Welcome to Signed, the podcast for buyers in a market built for sellers. I'm Max Clark, CEO of ITBroker.com. Today I'm sitting down with Scott Nicols, Chief Commercial Officer at Aurelion. Let's go. I still very much like talking about technology and what's going on with technology. But what I found was the more time we spent there, the more it was more about how are we applying technology to solve a business need, right? And so then, while I'm still interested in, still very much like a network engineer at heart and like still have that kind of, mindset around things and wanting to design and build, it shifts a little bit. It was like, okay, great. So you've got this thing here. Why do people actually buy it? How do you help somebody through the buying journey of this stuff? What's the evaluation process really like? How does this thing get evolved? And so like, so you ask like list of questions. I just keep this because, it's very easy for me to want to like wander off into the weeds sometimes.
No, that's guidance. After 200, you kind of have a...
Yeah, so you just
it makes sense.
You just kind of have a thing where you're like, okay, we kind of... And this, I wrote these out, 5-6 years ago. This grounding, experience of like, can I go back? Are we... probably the best advice I've ever seen from anybody was like, if you write out your intentions before you do something, you can always go back to what you had written out, and it's like, are you adhering to your intentions? And so I like that.
No, it makes perfect sense. Well, so to get on something you said, so I am not an engineer. I started out as a telemarketer back in the day of when telemarketing was a thing for Sprint, and I've always been in sales. I've only sold technology. So, I'm Chief Commercial Officer at Aurelion, so I've got sales operations, marketing, and one small piece of procurement called quoting and ordering. But I know enough to be dangerous, but to say that I'm an engineer, and if you go way deep in technology, I'm not going to be able to answer.
I'm not going to ask you about BGP communities.
Thank you.
Don't worry, we won't get into that part.
Which is definitely a conversation that we have with our clients all the time. But I say, let me get you with an engineer to talk about that.
The conversation with your client about BGP communities is like, give me every tool available to me as a widget so that way I can do my own stuff, right? Yeah. Like that's not, it's, Steve Jobs is famous. If you ask people in a focus group, what do they want? They're like, they just want more of what you're already giving them. So, once you say, once you say you have this, you can do traffic engineering, with metrics and communities and whatever else, they're just like, yeah, of course, more, give me all of them, so it's...
Well, I come primarily from the enterprise space, so I've lived in that space. I worked at Masergy and Experio for a bit, and then at Aurelion, we've been a 30-year lineage in being one of the largest wholesale companies in the world. And so about 5 years ago, we said we'll make the move into enterprise. And at the end of the day, we sell the same products, right? We're very focused on connectivity. We don't do SD-WAN, we don't do voice. We try to stay focused on what we're good at. But what's interesting about it, and what I see, is that the enterprise market, layer in AI and cloud and all the things that are going from site to site to data center, cloud instance to data center, the market is kind of rising to meet us in that. In the enterprise space, I'm having more conversations about IP transit than we've ever had before. We're seeing a rebirth of Ethernet, believe it or not, in a certain way, because it still is one of the best performing technologies out there. Most of my competitors have like a separate Ethernet network that's oversubscribed and not working. Ours is all in one. It's designed for that. So my Ethernet performs better than most. And so people are kind of like, if you can be price competitive, I'm interested. It's just that I've always been priced out versus a Wave or a DIA. So anyway, I'm seeing some interesting things coming from the enterprise space, but living in the wholesale lineage of Aurelion, formerly Telia. But the enterprise it's changed a lot. So I mean, and there's not much more I can say technically. I think I've expanded it. No, I'm kidding. But that's my level of conversation.
Let's start and talk about wholesale. Carrier, right? And pre-2010, right? Let's say like the real acceleration of what we see as the cloud today. The AWS, the Google, Oracle, whatnot. It was really common. We had an ecosystem where companies had data center builds, 10 cabinets, 20 cabinets, much smaller footprints typically in a data center at that point, right? So maybe 100 to 250 kilowatt in a data center. And there was a relatively robust ecosystem of tier 2 networks, networks that were buying from tier 1, from Tele at the time, right? And your competitors. And then going and providing layering service on top of that and giving to the enterprise. And whether that enterprise was, true enterprise, when I'd say like true enterprise, I mean like you're making revenue that's not connected to the internet or something.
Right.
Or,
right.
If you're in that like e-company, right, the SaaS companies, that was pretty typical. And we saw, IP transit and IP transport being dominant, structures at that point. Now, AWS, well, just say cloud. Cloud comes out, and now you've got interesting friction, right? Because the cloud companies become your customers, but at the same time, very much your competitor for the end user, right? And then enterprise starts shifting up into the cloud.
The whole cloud fabric thing they sell.
So how, and so now, everything is circular in tech, right? So now we see enterprises that are kind of coming back to, do we need data centers? Do we want to have our own physical infrastructure? Do we want to have committed capacity somewhere? Do we have performance advantages or financial advantages or, a whole slew of different things come into this equation that wasn't just this wholesale, like put everything here. Now it'll be a little more temperate. As you're looking at that and you start talking about, engaging with an enterprise. Now this enterprise has workloads in lots of different places. And how is that tension and friction working out with your network and your services you're delivering?
Well, I mean, for us, a lot of times enterprises stick with what they've had for years or what the last CTO, CIO said to put in there. So what we find is we say, why? They say, well, we have waves connecting these two data centers, and this is the workload that we do. And we go, okay, but why do you have that wave? Because it's really long, or we get, it's not performing, and there's a reason. And so they say, well, that's kind of what we've always had. And we said, well, let's look at your bigger network picture. We could connect that with EVPL, and then you can still have some path diversity, but it won't be nailed down. But the performance will be better because with our EVPL, we can. If there's a link that goes down, we can reroute that. So you might have a little latency, but it's not going to impact your workload or your user experience because right now your wave is up or it's down. And so that's an example of a conversation where we just say, why? What are you using it for and how are you using it? And so for us, like I said, we're focused just on connectivity. So I sell 5 things, So it's a very different conversation, and I can really drill down. I've got great engineers. I've got great, network planners and network. I'm trying to think of the role. I can see the guy's face, but anyway, there's a lot of different things that we can do because we're so focused just on this. And so the conversations are interesting because we're challenging some of the norms on what they've used. But when you look at the enterprise landscape, a lot of folks went and they said, we need SD-WAN for, application resiliency and blackout, brownouts, and all the great things that SD-WAN gives you. And that's awesome. But a lot of times SD-WAN's just told you that you've made terrible decisions on your underlay. And so, we come in and say, well, why did you choose this? And it was somebody else made a cost decision. I thought I could get away from Ethernet and DIA and just go DIA and fixed wireless or DIA and broadband. And those are great solutions. But there's the right solution depending on the type of site and the type of traffic and the type of application environment, Yep. So we say, look, you got an A, B, and C site. Let's go A site. Let's go Ethernet with DIA. And I don't care what you do B, C, but let's have the conversation about what you're using it for and why. We're seeing more and more of that. But what's constant in the enterprise space is the bandwidth requirement is doing nothing but grow. So SD-WAN making changes, becoming commoditized. Voice, very commoditized. And we're not in those businesses for that reason. But internet, cost per meg is always going down. There's always price pressure. But what you're seeing is the consumption requirement and the need is only increasing, and performance is increasing as well. So it's opening up other technologies. People said, oh, Ethernet's dead. It's definitely declining, but the use case is still there, but you have to talk about it. Does that make sense?
The whole Ethernet is dead thing is so funny to me. It reminds me of like early 2000s when an article would be, published of like, the internet's running out of bandwidth. And you're like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
You have no idea what you're talking about. And, my mind churns because as you're mentioning different things, I go lots of different places technically, right?
Yeah.
You go into the whole thing of like, when you're selling EVPL over, versus MPLS. In most cases, most networks, or even just an IP circuit on top of it, in most cases, most service provider networks is the same infrastructure. So trying to have that conversation with somebody and saying, why are you buying MPLS here versus just using internet? It's got the same routing path between point A and point B. Like, what's your objective that you're trying to achieve with this? It was common for networks for a while to have an optical core and then have some sort of IP core on top of it. So then we can get into an argument about whether or not buying waves is more efficient on that network or not. But even that isn't the same consideration in most places anymore. Like it's evolved and changed. And SD-WAN, I'm laughing because we get into SD-WAN conversations and somebody says we want SD-WAN. I'm like, okay, great. Which kind of SD-WAN, right?
Right.
Because there's like 5, right? Which problem are you actually solving?
It's the same conversation. Yeah. Why? What do you need it for?
Yeah.
So
a lot of people are just like, we can't figure out how to configure VPN on our firewall, and the SD-WAN just solves that problem for us. It just creates this magic VPN overlay, and I'm like, okay, yeah. I coming from somebody who had to configure a VPN on Cisco routers and PIX firewalls, or ASAs. I'm like, I totally get it. You configure your first one, you're like, it works. I don't know why it's working. Stop breathing. Like if it ever goes down, I don't know why.
Well, SD-WAN isn't anything new. It's packaging of some existing technologies in a different way. But, what we're seeing, we thought about it when I came on 4 years ago. They were like, we're going to go after the enterprise market in a bigger way. We're going to focus on, very subset of a subset. Do you want to sell SD-WAN? I'm like, no, I don't think we do. Yeah. Because nobody's selling enough of it to make it a huge sustainable part of their business. And then it's a very messy marketplace. Like you said, there's different, depending on what you're trying to solve. You buy different devices, stacks of software, etc.
The tension I see with SD-WAN, the people, I think a misconception that I deal with a lot is understanding the economics and the cost structure behind it. And so you have SD-WAN vendors, and even now, SASE is a little different animal because you're getting a security overlay, right?
That's.
But SD-WAN vendors that are pinning traffic against some sort of infrastructure, and a lot of those people are pinning traffic against some sort of cloud infrastructure, using one of the big cloud providers, and all of a sudden you're like, why is your cost structure so upside down? You're like, oh, I get why your cost structure is so upside down, because you've got this underlying cost that you can't deal with, right? Like, and it's and then it's that whole dynamic is really, it feels like so many of what we see in terms of SD-WAN being deployed is just we don't have networking talent that actually can help us design and architect and maintain, or we're trying to solve the evils of some OEM that we've already installed that we're committed to that we can't fix, so we can put something else here and kind of solve that problem. Enterprise, I'm curious about this. I'm a big advocate for every enterprise to go out and find and contract a small amount of data center space near their operations, especially their large sites, because it's like such a gateway to everything you could ever want to do. Whether you're purchasing bandwidth for a lot, you have completely different economics of purchasing bandwidth, any sort of transport changes, cloud on-ramps change. Everything changes when you're in a carrier-neutral facility close to you. And then metro circuits, of course, economically change. Yeah. Aurelion isn't a last mile provider.
Correct.
You're not in the United States like as a cable company or an eyeball network. So how has that dynamic been playing out for you with enterprises that start to like make this understanding and switch of like, I don't want to use my local LEC, or I don't want to use a local MSO because of whatever reason, capacity, cost, reach, whatnot. That makes interesting waters for you to navigate.
Yes and no. It's something we've been doing for a long time, right? In the wholesale space, because you don't talk about last mile when you're talking to carriers. But as enterprises shift, to your point, more to the data center model, cloud as well, connectivity conversations change. It's not so much site to size as it is, data center, cloud. We still see quite a bit of conversations around, I still need a tail circuit. When we go in, we'd love to just talk about IP transit and waves and Ethernet, right? But that's not where the problems lie. So when you meet with an enterprise, you say, you know, what can I help you solve, achieve, right? That's really the conversation. And a lot of times it is, I've made some, you know, commitments to this carrier. They use this tail circuit. I don't know who it is. You know, so a lot of times they don't know who it is. They just know it's not working. So we'd say, okay, well, that's a great conversation, but I'd really just like to talk about the stuff that's working well, which is your waves, your IP, you know, and build on that. But they go, you got to solve my problem first. That's reasonable. So we still have quite a bit of conversations around physical diversity, POP diversity when it comes to tail circuits. So even though the dynamic has changed, it's still part of our conversation. And, you know, most of the carriers in the US, as well as the large ones and small ones globally, are customers of ours. So buying tail circuits and deciding on what's the best path, how do we make diverse from whatever they're trying to at a site location based, isn't anything unique to us. We've been buying tail circuits for 30 years. We just do a lot more of it now because it's part of the enterprise need. Does that make sense?
Of course. Marketing, right, with networking companies or carriers. Wireless companies have been marketing 5G for, it feels like forever at this point.
Yep.
And a lot of that marketing has been like, I think, trying to invent a problem or a need within it. Oh, you know, we're going to provide fill in the blank, right? You know, autonomy because you can do low latency and sub whatever, blah, 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 blah to the edge. And it's been, you know, in my shoes, it's always like we're trying to invent the problem that people actually need to solve. And you're like, nobody's actually trying to solve that problem. Because for most applications, if you're talking about inside of a metro, major, you know, market, you're already really fast. I mean, latency, you know, what's the application that you need sub 2 milliseconds of latency for, right? Like, it doesn't really exist. And with AI in every segment of tech, everybody's running in with like what our AI strategy is. And
yes.
Like, we're an AI company, we're an AI network, this, that, you know, like all these really think. And on the one hand, it still feels like a similar case of smoke and mirrors and like hyperactive marketing trying to get onto the latest wave. But on the other side, we see really interesting demand patterns and curves changing, you know, and the amount of data that's flowing back and forth in these things. So how has AI really changed this demand curve for you with enterprises and the conversations you're having?
So, you know, you mentioned wireless. I definitely think there's a place for it. I think it's really cool technology. I spend a lot of time in that space, so I keep up with it a bit. But, you know, I'm a fan as a user, and I just think it's really interesting. And there's definitely a place for it in the enterprise sort of, you know, landscape. But, you know, AI for us, you know, you can get very technical and dig into, you know, GPUs and all different kinds of technologies. But for us, what we see, regardless of whether you're a platform provider, you're an infrastructure provider of AI, you're a platform provider leveraging AI, or you're an enterprise leveraging an AI application, if you will, it just drives more traffic. Mm-hmm. I mean, simply put, it just brings so much more traffic to the game. And as I mentioned before, we're seeing that as a big driver for somebody talking to a company like Aurelion, because, you know, you look at Kentech, who's got the biggest global backbone in the world. It's us. We were the first to launch 400 gig waves, IP transit, and we will be launching Ethernet fairly soon. We'll probably be the first to launch 800 gig. So we just passed a threshold, I think it was February, where we 200 terabits per second across our backbone. So if you're wanting to say, where do I go to the company that has the best, you know, who can accommodate my growing needs and my traffic, we're at the top of the list. So that's really what's getting us in the door, because they're seeing more traffic from AI than they've ever seen before. And it's not stopping, because, you know, everybody has, what's our strategy? And the answer is we're developing it a lot. You know, they kind of make it up as they go because it's just so new to the enterprise space. So it's one of those things where I think that AI is really driving things where our strengths, the market's kind of rising to meet us, because, you know, not too many companies can do 400 gig waves, 400 gig IP transit, and talk about 800, right? So it puts us in a good spot. Now, we're not a fit for everybody, but at the top end of the market across multiple verticals, where they're seeing a lot of use cases, then we're in those conversations. So again, it's well, I'd never heard of you guys before. People have heard of Telia before, right? But we've been in business for over 30 years. We've been in the U.S. for 27 years. We've got 300-400 POPs globally. Like I said, we're the only one that has one of the few that have a global backbone. We can do both DWDM systems and IP transit. We maintain both across the same backbone. So there's a lot of things that we do that a lot of companies don't do, and they just haven't heard the name.
If you're involved in actual backbone engineering, right?
Yes.
But if you weren't, you don't, right? It's
especially in the enterprise. If you advertise an AS number, AS 1299.
Yep.
And so you're very familiar with us. You may not know the name of the company, but you know the AS number. But if you're an enterprise, different story. I'm not going to use the word term surprised, but I'm still fascinated to see how like this skills gap enterprises have, and I credit. SD-WAN solved a problem, which was how do you deal with network engineering and skills gaps with network engineering. But then at the same time, it promotes an even bigger skills gap because people aren't coming up that actually understand how do you do this, how do you architect, how do you design, how do you configure BGP. You still see stuff all the time on the internet. It's like, somebody's doing something they shouldn't have with the routing table, and there's a little thing that happens. From your vantage point, right, you have to deliver a service, but you also have to create customers that can actually consume the service. And how do we create and establish the next generation of network engineers and actually understand how do you plan a backbone at a large scale? How do you make this decision, right? That's a tough question. The challenge I think all carriers have is the aging population and the lack of knowledge, like you said, in the space today. Young people coming out of college, it's not sexy to work at a carrier like it is at an AI company or pick one. So for us, most of our solution engineers are the secret sauce. The network planners and the IP engineers are the secret sauce. So we bring a team approach. And so I think that's what makes us a bit more sticky. Is that when you are trying to change how you're set up your network, or you have questions, or you've done it wrong, that's really when we bring in the big guns that are behind our global backbone that understand how this works on a global scale, and we say, look, let's talk about how this works and come up. We have multiple iterations on the architecture of the solutions and all those kind of things. To me, that's all positive. Those questions and those workshops that we put together are huge buying signs, and it becomes, you're a partner in the business, not just a vendor. But we definitely leverage our secret sauce, which is our solution engineers and our IP planners and backbone, and IP provisioners, and really the guys that are the peering managers. That's what I was looking for earlier, the peering managers and how all this works. Because it is sort of uncharted territory for some of these folks, and there is a gap there. But we bridge that gap because this is all we've done for 30 years. I've not had to be an SD-WAN expert. We've not tried to be a voice expert or a security expert. We've stayed focused on connectivity.
Peering is an interesting conversation to kind of move into for a second, right? Because this is a capacity planning, and you're scaling 400 gig, 800 gig, which means your customers are scaling to 400 gig, right?
Yep.
And where 1 gig was common, replaces with 10 gig. Now 100 gig is common, and people the early adapters are moving into the faster and faster speeds. But now you've got the laggards. The laggards are typically the eyeball networks, right? Or certain, geographies, let's say Asian countries, where you have really fast eyeball networks that are coming up, but then also interesting politics.
Yes.
I'm not going to name any country by name here. We'll keep this friendly. But you have interesting politics that then come into peering, in-region peering, out-of-region peering, what capacity is transiting an ocean or not. And that creates pressure on you as well, because you have to kind of increase. Saying we're going to go from 400 gig to 800 gig isn't just we're going to change some line cards out, right? Now you have to look at the whole system as a whole and be how do we elevate the entire thing, right? And what's also been wild to witness over the years is we just turned up a new peering link in capacity with whatever network, and it was turned on and then it went to 100% capacity instantaneously.
Yes.
So how years ago we had like the peering battles, the peering wars, the peering cakes being sent back and forth, and we haven't really seen this stuff for a little while. It seems to have simmered down a little bit, but how are you seeing this with the eyeball networks? Whether it's in like the United States or internationally, kind of at the same time competing with rising bandwidth demands and how fast of service they're giving to their end user, what's oversubscribed and not oversubscribed. We won't talk about all the dirty secrets.
Yeah. Well, keeping our network, running at the right, I guess, at yellow versus running at red is a challenge. I'm not probably skilled enough to technically to say, okay, this is how I see the peering changing. That's not, my strong suit. But, when I look at the network map and we see this stretch on yellow, this stretch on red, it really comes down to proactive management, understanding where your traffic is coming from, what you've sold, and then managing those vendor relationships. And whether it's a fiber provider, whether it's our own network we have to overpull, whether it's a situation expanding a DWM system, it's all about proper planning and owning your own global backbone for 30 years and being all you've done. You get really good at that anticipation and the planning, and it comes to when we get certain deals that are in Salesforce. As a sales guy, I live in Salesforce, right?
Uh-huh.
So when it gets to stage 4, that's when my planners start to be aware of it. And if, we run different scenarios, what if we win this? Do we have the capacity? Yes, no, should we start planning for this now? So it can be anything from, the CDN networks, it could be broadcasters, it could be, you name it. So again, I can't get into the peering conversation too deep, but what I can tell you is managing available capacity and making sure that we always have enough overhead to accommodate all the traffic that we've sold and all the burst traffic we could get. I'd love to tell you it's a real easy thing to do, but it's an art as much as it is a science, and I leave that up to the smart people that have been running our network for 30 plus years.
There is there's a personality, like an old salty sales personality, where it's they'll talk about like the race to zero with telecom and networking and bandwidth, and on one hand I appreciate the sentiment because it used to be you could make like T1s were very expensive once upon a time. Like, the first time I sold a T1, it was egregiously expensive, or installed a T1. And, and if you're selling a gig E circuits once upon a time were expensive and now are, but you're looking at it like, well, okay, you're selling a gig E circuit and we're selling 800 gig circuits, and like, there's a big difference, delta between those two. How, that creates a lot of pressure also, for you and your sales organization, right? Because you've got to create new capacity. People are looking for more bandwidth. It's like, does it ever feel like you're off the wheel of like cyclic upgrades and ever increasing demand and capacity?
You're not. I mean, if you talk to anybody, you look at a lot of the competitors in the market. It's the CapEx budget has always got to be there, and you've always got to be looking: should I build? Should I buy? And then all the equipment that's on the ends of those stretches, the fiber. I mean, it is a wheel, and I'd love to say that it's you get to a point it's just okay. But it's you're always trying to figure out, where should I put my money? What's the best investment I can make and return on that? Be it a new fiber stretch, do I at the same route? Do I look at a new route? Because the things that the big companies, the hyperscalers, the cloud companies, it's less about the price. It's more about the speed to deliver and the diversity of the path. All that means CapEx, right? So it is absolutely, you said it right, it is absolutely a wheel that you have to manage on. Okay, if I put this here, it can't be if you build it, they will come. It's got to be, I know that there's companies that have a demand for this. We've seeded the market with this. We're gonna make it and make sure that we can not only maintain what we have, but also be interesting to those next wave of users coming on, because everybody wants different markets. I mean, you look at, there's a lot happening in the Nordics right now. There's a lot happening in Iceland right now. It's 5 years ago, if you'd have said those are the hot spots for, new data center builds and fiber need, no way. But it's all about chasing the power. I mean, there's a lot of dynamics to the market, but it is a constant conversation that we have about, okay, here's the CapEx budget. We have to keep the lights on. turn this red to yellow or green, this stretch. So there's maintenance of existing traffic, but also how do we continue to grow the network and be attractive to, that next wave of customers who are saying, I'm unhappy with this legacy provider. I want to look at an Aurelion. What do they have that's unique and better, and why? I'd love to say it's always there.
That's an interesting dynamic to talk about. The original, I don't want to say original, but for a long time, network builds followed major metro markets, right? So you have center of gravity of the internet, West Coast, the Bay Area, East Coast, Ashburn area.
Of course.
But then everything else was, whether it was related to a cable landing station, system, right? So Miami versus Seattle, West Coast, New Jersey, right? So you had where the cables, the oceanic cables are coming in, or you had Atlanta's a huge market. So you end up with data, infrastructure in Atlanta. And then you have, it's cheap land. We're going to build data centers there. And we just have, so there's but now, you talk about data centers, if you're doing a gigawatt data center project, this isn't going into downtown New York.
No.
It's going into places that haven't had any build before.
Grand Prairie, Texas. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Or Oak Cliff, South Oak, Red Oak, or farther. Like middle of nowhere projects, right? So data center companies have to compete with, cost of capital, location, entitlement, stability of local government, and geopolitics, right? Can they get the power? How much does the power cost? But so you get all this stuff to entitle, and then all of a sudden you turn around, and you're like, oh, we're going to put in this, gigawatt data center project that's not going to be 100 meg circuit going into it. That throws your capacity planning for, I don't want to say a loop, but all of a sudden now you're looking at it okay, there's going to be a lot of something happening in this facility. How far ahead are you engaged in those conversations, and how much of that is, does this become a strategic customer and a strategic site for us? Are we trying to stub this off of something else? We're going to see a lot of these stubs coming off of cities versus primary network nodes.
Yeah. Usually when we're involved in these things, it's driven by a large customer build, right? And a specific purpose-built data center. And, long term, you have to decide, is this something we want to do? Because generally we've made our money where we say we're in this area, this POP, this data center, pick your terminology, because we know that there's 30 different customers there, and there's another 75, 100, 1,000 that we don't have that we want to win out of that, right? When you do a purpose-built data center, you got to make sure that it really makes a ton of sense, because the money it costs to build into that, all the things you mentioned, is not small, and it's got to be a long-term contract. And okay, am I able to also have other customers leverage this so I get the best bang for my buck? We don't do a ton of those. We do a few of them, and we take those decisions, very seriously, because it's a huge commitment. But I think you're going to see more spurs off of networks, or you're going to see. I was trying to think. There was a deal we did in North Dakota for a large customer, and we had to basically resell a local provider who happened to also be a customer. So it was a lot. That's one of the values we bring. And we bought network, and they had to do a small build to get to our closest POP, which was not in North Dakota. but then once it hit our backbone, it was great for us. So we did you think, well, that sounds like an enterprise deal where you buy a tail, and but it was over bigger geographies. We're seeing more and more of that from the big hyperscalers, to where they want to be in a certain geography for whatever reason, power, space, pick it, but there's nobody there. So they have to call the local provider, and they don't want to mess with that. But we know those local providers; they're all customers. So we tie those guys together to get to our closest POP. So we're seeing a lot more of that, and I think that's going to be continued to be the norm, versus everybody wants to be in 60 Huts or in the Infomart or in, what is it, Wilshire?
Wilshire.
Yeah, One Wilshire. So I think we're going to see more and more of that kind of spur, or kind of off the beaten path, back into the main artery of the network that's existing.
How much do you think data sovereignty is driving conversations and selections now of locations for customers?
It's always a part of the conversation, and everybody's got, it's like anything else. People have very strict, people have a little more loose. So, but it's not something that I deal with. I make sure that our attorneys and our folks deal with that and make sure we cover our bases. But it's always part of the conversation these days, as is ISO certification, as is, all the security things that are happening in the industry today.
Yeah. Data sovereignty seems like it's going to start ratcheting up big time. It feels like there's, certain geopolitical alignments changing and shifting and, pressure to have things in certain markets.
It's never dull, for sure.
Yeah. Layer 8 issues are always fun to deal with. It's like, I just want to build a network. Do I really have to deal with this?
I want to stay at 2 and 3, maybe 1.
Yeah, no, I just want to make the lights blink.
Yes.
Can I just make the lights blink, please? This show exists because of what we do at itbroker.com. If you're in the middle of a real tech decision right now, new technology, vendor selection, a contract that doesn't feel right, an M&A event that just landed on your lap, and so on, we help buyers like you get it right. Independent strategy, sourcing, and contract negotiation. No kickbacks, no sales quotas, just someone in your corner. Schedule a call at itbroker.com. Back to the episode. He said something a little bit ago that I want to venture back into. Enterprise customers have different demands and pressures of how they acquire technology. And, there was a promise for cloud for a long time that I don't even know how this seeded out. It was like, it's going to be cheaper for you to be on a cloud. And we all know that cloud is not cheaper. Like anybody who's ever done anything with cloud, nobody will tell you they're buying cloud because it's cheaper. They're getting other things out of it. Yeah. Flexibility, scale. They're displacing their entire procurement load onto something else that nobody can actually deal with. It's like, oh yeah, we're spending this much money here. And nobody's like, okay, spend less. And they're like, we can't, sorry. We have to deal with you anymore. But then now a lot of these projects where we're talking about enterprises getting back into control and taking control of their infrastructure again.
Yeah.
Some of that conversation starts with cost. Some of that conversation starts with performance. Some of that conversation just comes from like budgeting and predictability. And that third one has been very interesting for me to watch as well, of like how much of the predictability is actually driving a lot of like, cost versus performance. When you're engaging with an enterprise customer, and in 400 gig circuits, we're talking, this is a significant network build. How much of it is performance? How much of it's cost? How much of it now is just saying, hey, we know we have this capacity, it costs us this much money, we can plan around it, we know what we're working with, and getting back into this idea of like, owning and operating our network again.
Yeah. So I think the first kind of lever on that conversation is the cost, right? To your point, they've put all this stuff in the cloud. Yes, they can scale, but the predictability is hard, right? And it's a big number. And so then they say, what's the best way to utilize this? It's kind of like the wireless conversation. There's definitely a use case for it. And there's obviously a use case for cloud, but you think about, okay, what do we need to put in the cloud versus what do we need to take back or put someplace else? And I think those are the conversations that we see more companies having because it starts with cost, but then there's I still need to be able to scale. I still need to be able to do things quickly. We say, maybe put your storage and some compute in the cloud and put other things, applications in different data centers. I leave a lot of those conversations to the engineers, but I think to your point, the cost of cloud and the extreme, it can spike and is what's making people step back, enterprises step back and say, is this the right use of this spend? And are we doing this correctly? And maybe not. And so I think those are the conversations we're involved in where they say we want to move this from the cloud to our, big HQ site or to this data center site. And that's going to change the way our network topology is working. Can you help us with this? And we're like, absolutely. But I bring in the smart people for those conversations.
Getting into cost conversations with cloud or performance conversations with cloud, people get very focused on the cost of compute, cost of storage. And for me, the relative cost for compute or the relative cost for storage, I mean, you can build your own infrastructure, have bare metal, there are different tiers of it, and you can get a more efficient compute cost, right? But that's not the big lever for me. And I'm, trying to explain somebody the difference of purchasing 100 gig on your network versus paying for 100 gig on a cloud provider. Like, the delta is so extreme that people don't believe it's actually true when we get into this psych and this conversations. So How are you managing that cycle? Because I find it very, like, it's hard to be upfront and be like, hey, by the way, this is what you're paying and this is what it would cost to do an alternative. And then, certain times I get responses that are like, oh, you're lying to me. And I'm like, no, I promise this is actually, here's paperwork. I can prove it,
But the cloud's so much cheaper.
Oh, no. I mean, look, everything's negotiable, but like your base rate on egress and cloud is 5 cents a gig, right? So, the cost differential from that to an IP transit link, 300 times more expensive. It's significant, right?
Yeah. I personally don't get into those conversations when at that level. Usually companies have made a decision one way or another, and that's when they bring us in, or that's when I've been involved. So I can't really speak to that to say, well, this is why somebody would do it. I mean, part of the conversation is, okay, your cloud provider is not a network provider. They've got a cloud fabric that they've stitched together, and they can do a lot of things. But then where does that traffic need to go? How does it traverse the internet? That's really where our strength comes in. But from a cost perspective, no argument there. Mm-hmm. Usually we're not faced with this. Putting 10 gig access in the cloud versus buying 10 gig of IP transit. Tell me why I should do this. Those conversations are well past by the time we get that. They know what they want typically.
The interfaces on these clouds, for Direct Connect or Express Routes, I mean, they're way behind industry performance in terms of Ethernet speeds. And I don't know how much of that is just, I don't know how much of it is intentional to keep people captive to a certain degree, and how much of it's just that they're so far behind getting these network links up. Given that like all these cloud companies are your customers for your IP transit and transport networks, as well as you're trying to deliver service for your enterprise customers to connect to them, do you see this friction continuing, or should we continue to expect, you think, for people, for the cloud networks to be, you're rolling out 800 gig. How long before we see 400 gig available, for private connections?
Yeah. Great question. I can't, we provide a Cloud Connect service, and that's as far as we go into the cloud. So I can't say what's on their roadmap, but yeah, the price erosion is, and price compression is always there. And it comes from different places, not only competitors that are in our same space, but also from the cloud providers looking to sell as well. So, but I can't speak to that as much as I probably. If I have my engineer here, maybe I could do a bit better.
Yeah, well, we'll do
I
that
told
later.
you I'm not an engineer.
I'm trying to walk the line here carefully. Network as a service is becoming a term, it feels like it's taken hold now in terms of like a segment. And and I've seen some companies selling network as a service where it really feels like they're trying to create a new product category that they can have different commercials on, and not necessarily actually delivering like service value to the customer. And I see other network as a service companies coming online that are really trying to create this like again back to like that SD-WAN magic. It like feels like an iteration of SD-WAN.
Yeah. Where
we can do all this stuff for you. You don't have to know how it works. When you're looking at and people are looking at this and you're saying, okay, well, in most cases it's probably writing on your network, and there's some overlay on top of it. Is this something that you now have to chase and figure out like what's the actual economic driver or customer requirement that's driving like why is NAS all of a sudden becoming a thing?
Yeah. And
some of your competitors, I believe it's a thing because their contracting cycles are so difficult to deal with, right? Like I can't contract with you easily. I can't install with you easily. I can, it's not easy to work with you. So therefore I have to go do something else.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that everybody's looking for their value proposition in the space, right? And I think NAS, network as a service, I think a lot of it, the core of it, is the ability to scale quickly. Yes, there's the analytics piece. I think that it really depends on what the enterprise is wanting to do themselves and what they want to contract out for. You pay premium for all those services, and so you see, I'll liken it to an SD-WAN sort of life cycle that we've seen. most companies started out buying a SD-WAN from a managed services provider. So they would the company would install, they would do the underlay, they do the overlay, and you'd pay a premium for them to manage it. And over 3-year term, 6-year term, the IT teams have kind of gotten wise to this, and they've said, we can manage these things, and we may or may not need a managed service provider because we can maybe roll our own. So on the second or third iteration of SD-WAN, they've bought their own boxes, they've bought their own software, they're managing it themselves, and they've made that choice over time. Some companies are absolutely still with managed service providers for the same reason. They don't want to manage it, but you pay a premium for that. So for us, it's really about qualifying the opportunity to say, look, we are an underlay provider, and that's what we do. And we can scale really quickly. Our processes are this. If you want all the other bells and whistles on top of that, you can either pay for SD-WAN yourself, buy somebody else. We can play with work well with others, but this is what we do well. And so network as a service providers have a different proposition than I do. We're pretty straightforward with the connectivity. Our ability to scale and deliver fast is one of the reasons we've been successful globally. And so to me, when I hear network as a service, yes, there's the monitoring and some of the other bells and whistles, but at the underlying, it's the ability to scale and make it easy for the customer. We do that anyway. So if they want more, then it's really about us qualifying the opportunity, saying, what do you really want? Like we will lose an opportunity because some customers will quote, I will do this with a NAS provider or an SD-WAN provider who does managed services. Mm-hmm. And then I'll do another business case that says, I'm going to roll my own devices, my own software on SD-WAN or SASE or whatever, but I'll do the underlay separately. Mm-hmm. And some we win, some we lose. It just depends on how they want to spend their money. I don't know if that answers your question,
no.
But it's...
I get it. Common in the network space, backbone carrier space, is growth by acquisition. So we see, and this has been true for a long time, right? So growth by acquisition, or buying customer traffic.
Yep.
Through price points. Aggregators notoriously do this, right? Where they have they have to sell to a certain point, or they have committed capacity, and whatever they have undersold, like it's either take the loss on it or sell it for anything you can, right? Creates downward pressure on the market. And those companies end up in a life cycle that either ends with bankruptcy and a reorg, which also has divestiture of assets, or there's some big networks right now that have way too high of a debt load and are trying to avoid the bankruptcy and are shedding assets as quickly as they can find anyone to buy them. How do you stay focused on your core business, and not get wrapped up into the crazy? I mean, Aurelion has been doing this for a long time, and you've managed to stay out of this craziness. How much of that is just, corporate lineage and culture, and how much of that is just like every day, oh, this company's doing this thing. Do we have to chase them or not? Or,
Well, we've tried before, right? It hasn't been a big scene, but we have quietly tried to do some other things to diversify that revenue stream, to offer more of the stack. But at the end of the day, I think, prior to me joining the company, I've been here been at Aurelion for 4 years now. I mean, the decision was, look, we're going to place our bet that connectivity is going to be the underlying most important thing in the stack. Mm-hmm. And we're not going to play in the race, the voice game, the security game, the SD-WAN. We're just not going to do that. So it was more of a corporate lineage to say, let's stick with what we're good at, and not try to be all things to all people. And, knock on wood, so far that's paid off with us. One of the big value propositions that we have compared to the market, like I mentioned before, is the network performance. When you acquire multiple networks, you acquire networks that were never designed to work together, and you've got all kinds of technical reasons why. It could be vendor problems. It could be different ways of doing signaling across disparate networks, but they were never designed to work together. So when you place that across a global need, you got performance issues, you've got latency issues. I mean, you've got all kinds of issues. We have stayed true to what we do. So every expansion we've done was designed just like the other components of our network, so it all works together well. So over time, I've been able to separate myself to say, I'm the best global provider there is in terms of delivery experience. I'm the best global provider there is in terms of network performance, because my network is, is homegrown, and it's ubiquitous, and it's designed to work together. I've never tried to be a voice, an SD-WAN, a security, a managed device, company. I've stayed true to what I'm good at, and we are the best at that. So it's kind of been a lineage choice, but I think long run it's seeming to pay off because, like I mentioned, a lot of these things are getting commoditized: voice, SD-WAN, all these other things. Whereas the only thing that's really growing in the stack is the need for the network, and AI is only driving that. Cloud has been a huge driver for us as well. So yeah.
We have to qualify part of that, right? Because you say we're not a security company. You're not a security company in the sense that you're not providing firewalls for your customers, or you're hanging off their networks. But, backbones have their own security issues, right?
We do provide DDoS. Yes. So we do that.
Let's talk about DDoS for a little bit, right? Because I can, again, been doing this for a little bit, right? And, I remember the days where it was like, oh, it's a 10 gig DDoS, a volumetric attack at 10 gig. And you're like, oh, wow, that's so big. What are we going to do about it, right? And so this is one of those like double-edged swords for me. It's like, oh, your backbone just went from a 10 gig to 100 gig to 400 gig, 800 gig. We're going to be over a terabit in a heartbeat, right? Like, and you look at that and you're like, okay, great. So the unintended consequence, of course, for this, or like eyeballs, right? It's like, oh, we're upgrading, to giggy, 2.5 gig, 5 gig, 10 gig pretty soon to the homes, right? Like that has unintended consequences as well that comes down the line. DDoS is a very crazy animal to deal with at your scale. So, I'm going to leave that as like a lead in, not actually, get into specifics just yet. I'm curious your response to this is, again, somebody, who has to provide the capability and protect the customer and then sell this as a service, which at one point became like, I think DDoS was, here's actually the first part of the question. DDoS was like an optional thing that people were not buying. And I look at it as like very much this is core capability. Now.
What's the old saying? Security is step 0 in building a network, right?
Yeah.
So our DDoS solution is something that we built and use internally. And so we've decided to sell it as well on top of, services 5-6 years ago. So it's actually absolutely something that is native to our core. So the solution that we sell is the same solution that we provide. And we can recognize an attack and mitigate that attack very quickly. And, I can't get into specifics, but, 10 gig is nothing.
Yeah, 10 gig is nothing.
And so what we've seen is some of the biggest in the world, and we've been able to quietly mitigate those for our customers that it's happened to. So, you never want to talk too specifics about security and all that stuff about customers. But
I think what I'm curious about is, when we're selling and helping deploy large links and IP transit links, part of the conversation very quickly turns into what's your DDoS strategy across this link,
yes.
right? And I feel like it's finally getting to the point where people accept it. Like we understand that we need to do something to protect it here. How, I don't want to say like what percentage of like buying DDoS versus not, but like how much of that conversation shifted for you over the course of the last like 4 or 5 years, 3-4 years of like, is that still a lot of tension in the process, or is it like, hey, do you have DDoS? Do you want ours? Do you have somebody else's? Like, what is your plan?
That's exactly it. I mean, what we always recommend it, right, as part of the package, and sometimes we include it depending on how much the customer's spending and their need for it. But a lot of customers already have it, and they have it as part of a different part of their existing stack. And we say, get it, but the way that ours works is you only pay when there's a small monthly fee, but you only really pay a meaningful amount when we're mitigating an attack. So it's more like a very good insurance policy that you only need when it happens, whereas other companies had different business models. So we sell it a lot more than we used to because it's more prevalent, but a lot of companies already have that box checked and they don't want to talk about it because it's part of a broader security strategy.
Yeah, and also within that, right, you talk about like charging to mitigate an attack. You're really talking about what's going through a scrubbing center, right?
Exactly.
Because if you can block an attack
going
on the
up
edge,
to the cloud or whatever.
Yeah, if you can block with a rule on appearing, on an edge, right? Like that's, a lot of attacks are like, oh, we can just block it on our edge and boom, push out, flow spec rule and you're done, right? I mean, I make it sound really simple, but
of course, no, but to your point, I mean, there's companies that specialize in that and they market heavily to that, and so it's part of our fiber as a company.
Yeah.
And it's not something we've said we're this big security company. We're a connectivity provider, but it is part of our ecosystem. And so we're selling it more and more, but it wouldn't be the thing that I put as my front.
Yeah.
You know, we're known as the largest IP transit company in the world.
Right.
You know, single, I think top 4 wave provider in the U.S. You know, all these things. AS 1299 is highest quality, more so than, hey, we have this great DDoS product, right?
No, of course. I mean, it used to be like DDoS was the product where people were out buying it, and I'm actually really happy to say this. I'm really happy to say that it's moved into, it's like you have a lock on your house, you have an internet connection, you have DDoS. Like it feels like we finally hit that point because there was just a decade plus of pain. Right?
Of course.
And I'll say, like, working with, you know, I'll use this term, like a security engineer, you know, that's going through and doing and you know, and filtering DDoS attacks are some of the most enjoyable conversations I've ever had, right? In terms of like the quality and the skill set of the people you're interacting with. Now, in the time, you know, the joke for you know, network engineers, it's like denial of sleep attack, right? Like it's not, you know, like when we go back. And like I talk to people that want to deploy some sort of like on-premise of their own DDoS system, and I'm just like, you're out of your you know, like I have to be polite, but like I'm in my mind, I'm thinking you're out of your mind. Like you have, like, this is nuts. Don't do this.
Right.
You know, the other part of it that I don't think people really understand or appreciate is you have a lot of customers. So your obligation is providing, you know, a performant product for all of your customers. And there is a point where if a customer is degrading that experience, you know, the blast radius is affecting other customers, you know, somebody has to make a decision and be like, you know.
Absolutely.
You know?
I mean, and those are all covered in MSAs and things like that, because at some point you have to do what you need to do to, like you said, protect your other customers. But, you know, it's something that we monitor and use internally all the time, 24/7. It's part of, you know, when you can't do all the security certifications without proving that you can do all these things. So, but like I said before, to say that people know us from our DDoS service, no. But it's absolutely part of the conversation. I think the uptick when we sell network is improved. We actually bolted it onto it. We have it's called IP Secure, where it's a package deal. We sell a lot of that, but to say it's 70-80% of our sales, no. But it is an extremely good service, and the reason we don't sell it more is because a lot of companies are already locked into an agreement with a long-term contract. It's part of a bigger, strategy. So
it's like, great, you have it, fantastic.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, like little PSA commercial here is, you know, if they're not on your network and they want to come buy your DDoS, it's not like something that they're going to go and provision in 10 minutes. But if they're on your network and they're having an attack and they haven't provisioned DDoS with anybody, they can get yours pretty quickly. Like this isn't like we're going to spend days and weeks and months deploying something. It's like, oh, we have an issue, we need to resolve this issue, and your NOC team can be like, okay, yeah, we can facilitate this pretty quickly for you.
That's right. Once it's up, it's very easy to use, and it's not, and like anything, it's not fire and forget, but it's something that we do a very good job at, and we have thwarted some of the biggest attacks that there have been across the internet. Again, I can't say names, but big stuff. So,
you know, I don't want to. I don't say this to like, you know, network engineering, backbone engineering, network capacity, right? I don't want to say like it's a solved problem. I don't want to position it like that, because, you know, going from 10 gig to 100 gig introduces like all sorts of new problems across the entire environment. You know, going from 100 gig to 400 gig, 400 gig to 800 gig. Now, you know, after 800 gig. I mean, this next decade of growth, you know, the capacity curve is going to be just absolutely staggering to watch.
Yeah.
You know, and then like the demands of enterprises coming in and coming back and becoming a core customer of yours, like that changes this game a little bit for you as well. So, I mean, as you're looking forward over the course of like the next year, next 2 years, I don't want to phrase it like what challenges do you see or what are you overcoming, but like what's been surprising in that like planning process of thinking through and trying to get ahead of a little bit?
Well, we've had to be much more proactive with having equipment caches available for cards and expansion very quickly. You know, to your point, you ask some of the social networks or hyperscalers for a forecast.
Capacity planning.
They say pick a number.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, honestly. So you can only do what you can do, and you have to monitor it. And it's something we've gotten very good at in terms of understanding what's coming. We communicate with our customers all the time, and we see big spikes or big drop-offs. You know, it's really just staying on top of it. But to say that we have the magic formula to, you know, problem solve, no. Because, you know, 5-6 years ago, we weren't even talking about AI workloads, and that's changed the game completely. What it's done for us is we've had this big, massive global network for years and years and years, and we're looking, how do we always say it, we need to fill up the suit, you know, how do we fill the pipes, if you will. And this has really, I mean, this has played in our favor in a lot of ways, but it's not stopping.
Well,
so,
you know, like ideally you would run your capacity at like 100%. And there would never be a spike that would go over 100%.
No
but then
way.
That's not the way that the internet works. So
No
it's like
way.
you have to run way lower capacity.
Absolutely.
And you touched on supply chain briefly. You know, COVID changed the supply chain game for a lot of people, right?
Well, there's been many things that have impacted the supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, memory prices right now are changing the supply chain, right? So, but that's also an interesting challenge for you, right? Because you're not talking about like trying to figure out how to do parts depot in one country.
No.
Now you're talking
it's
about
global.
like how do you do on a continent by continent basis do parts depot.
Well, and that's it. I mean, we have a strategy there to where globally we can get anything there in a matter of days, and some places hours. But the real dynamic that we've seen is that, you know, a lot of the larger hyperscalers and companies like this are going directly to these manufacturers, and so we're not competing with our you know, other carriers for equipment. We're competing with and so they got deep pockets and big checks. And if I'm an OEM, an equipment manufacturer, well, I'm going where that money is. So you throw any disruption in the supply chain, distribution, manufacturing, pick a topic, we all get hurt. So you just, again, for us, it's a matter of we're in a good spot now because we've had this massive network for years, and we're starting to really get a big use out of it. But now we have to continue to grow, and we have to continue to expand in those spurs, like I mentioned, in other areas, overpull in some areas that are now hot places for data center stuff. And so you're trying to get fiber, you're trying to get equipment, you're trying to get construction permits and all those things that happen. It's not easy layer on top of the supply chain issue, you know. So you just have to stay as ahead as you can. You have to forecast accurate and somewhat conservative delivery timelines to your customers when there's construction or there's equipment issues. And you know, you have to be transparent on what the situation is.
So it's an interesting horse cart conversation, right? So hyperscalers come in, big enterprises come in, and they have a very simplistic requirement set. You know, they want very fast, low latency Ethernet connectivity. Right now, you get into, you know, how are you actually building out your core leaf and spline? You know, are you doing BGP based, you know, VPN architectures inside of the data center in order to deal with containers? Like, there's a whole different set there, but they don't need MPLS. They don't need EVPNs. They don't, like, it's a simplistic set, right? But at the same time, because of the, you know, the inventory, the parts, you know, how much, what they're ordering, right? That's good because the chip manufacturers now have a pipeline of manufacturing which drives down prices on those chips that become available, right? So like there's a certain curve where you're like, okay, demand's crazy, but cost per chip can now decrease because volume capacity increases. But then you've got the OEMs, right, that actually build infrastructure
Put
that
the
you
box
need.
Together. Yeah,
there's not very many of them.
correct.
There's consolidation in the market taking place, right? Which will still, you know, be interesting to see how this plays out. And so then you've got another, like, you know, horse and cart issue where you need to grow your capacity. There's not very many OEMs that can build that capacity, but like how much of that capacity they're building for the network providers. I mean, you're buying lots of gear, lots and lots and lots of gear, right? So you're a dominant customer for them. And there's a few other networks that are buying lots and lots and lots of gear. But like compared to the enterprise customer, you know, they buy lots of gear as well. And so like their product plans are very, you know, like that's a fascinating, you know, problem to deal with as well. It's like how much of this do you think at this point is like the horse driving the cart, or the cart's driving the horse, or, you know, like what's the push and pull like?
I mean, that's a tough spot for them to be in right now, right? Because, you know, I talked to some of our equipment manufacturer guys, and they say every morning I wake up and there's 4 escalations because somebody, us included, needs more stock, and they have to figure out how they make all that work. And that's been the last year. So it's a rarely, I mean, supply chain issues during COVID aside, the dynamic of who's buying and the volumes they're buying, nobody can, just like they can't make a network, a traffic forecast, they can't make an equipment forecast. A lot of the bigger, the good, only good news is, the data center builds take a long time, right? You're not slapping those up in 90 days. Those are multiple years,
Yep.
right? And so you can kind of plan for those. It's the ones where they want to buy, 4 by 400 gigs and they need it installed in 90 days and 60 days. And you're like, oh my, it's 60 days. And we have enough stock to get here, but we need more, it's those things that challenge. And it's not just us, it's all the carriers. So I don't have a great answer for you. I know that we put a lot of pressure on those guys, and we communicate with those guys on a weekly basis because the forecast changes, the needs change. And they're in a tough spot. I mean, it's a good problem to have. We just have to produce more so we can sell more. But there's challenges with that too. But I don't know the right answer and how that's going to play out. It's, you can't have one vendor, you can't have two, you got to have at least 2 or 3 for this reason. But you have to make sure all of it works in your network well, because you might be swapping one vendor out for another. I mean, there's all kinds of challenges inherent to that too. We don't have 50 vendors, so that makes it simple. Our like I said, the way our network is designed, it can accommodate all of our vendors, so we can plug and play as needed for growth. And that's an advantage we have, but it is not easy. So I don't have an answer.
Let's talk about like 12 months. I don't know if we'll see terabit in 12 months, but we're going to see terabit pretty quickly. As capacity is just going to the moon at this point in terms of demand. What is the timeline for rollout going to be going forward for increase in capacity and backbone capacity, right? Because I don't think a lot of people understand the actual pricing dynamics that goes into like a network like yours upgrading, right? So if you just look at a pop at one of these carrier hotels, there is an inflection point where it is cheaper to purchase and do legs, saying 4 by 400, right? Like there is cost in power, cost in line card, cost in optics, right? Is it cheaper to do 4 by 400 or 2 by 800? And with every new, every time this comes out, like it's cheaper to do 4 by 400 for a while, and then it becomes finally cheaper to do 2 by 800.
Yes.
Or you need more capacity, so you kind of get forced into 4 by 800. And so it's not this like, oh, 800's available, let's just go roll it out. It's like, okay, 800's available.
Absolutely.
When does it hit the price point that it actually makes sense for us to switch, right? It feels like that window is starting to shorten for a lot of networks in terms of the capacity demands that are being pushed onto these networks of like old math isn't mathing anymore, and,
Yes.
that push for performance has overtaken it.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have an answer to it. What I can tell you is that the migration from 10 gig to 100 gig was fairly gradual over the course of several years. You had COVID in there. You had some other things that delayed some of that. I mean, it spiked up capacity. But to your point, the move from 100 to 400 has been dramatic. Is very shorter than the previous jump. And so, to solve the problems, you got a couple different options. You can do 1 by, 1 400 or do 4 100s. And it all depends on where and how fast and all that stuff. So we have all those conversations with the customers so we can accommodate the capacity need, but how we solve it could be a couple different ways depending on where it is. We haven't rolled out 800 yet. It's tested in the lab and it's working, but to say what the price and the capacity of the impact from a timing perspective is going to be, I don't have that answer today.
Yeah.
But I have a fear that it's going to be even faster than 100 to 400.
I find a lot of companies, when they start looking at doing any sort of bonded links that haven't I mean, again, it's like, this is a weird thing where it's like, depending what your lineage and your experience and background with it is, there's just certain things you don't know until you run into it, right?
Yeah.
If you're doing 4 by 100 links, your capacity for a single stream is, whatever your interface is. You've got a 100 gig limit in terms of how fast you can move traffic. Yes, you've got 400 gig worth of capacity, but one stream can be 100 gig, and trying to work through that in capacity planning is also interesting with people. It's like, well, do you need just capacity?
I'm glad you said we're not going to get into the technology too much in this.
A little bit.
We're going deep in there now. We're talking capacity planning.
But we're talking capacity planning, but it applies, right? Because now you start talking about it, it's like, how much is your sales team actually going back to your customer and saying, hey, we want to buy 4x4, does the order cycle start with, we want 400 gig of capacity? And you're like, do you want 4x100? Do you want 1x400? They say we need 800. Are you saying, do you want 1x800, 2x400, 8x100? Like how... Because that, again, has a different cost implication to you. In a data center, you have cross connects you have to account for, right? Like that's usually not your side of the table, but...
No, it is. It definitely is.
Okay.
But I think it really, there's no one answer fits all. And in some places, we can accommodate the requirement easily. Sometimes we have to say, look, we have to move these cards from here to here to accommodate this, or we can only do so much at this pop. So there's a lot of conversations that take place about how we configure the solution that they need. It typically starts out with a capacity requirement, and then we say this is how we can fill it, and here's the path that we would do it in. And they say, nope, we want to change it, do this and this and this. It's rarely that they say we want one option, one way, and that's all we'll take. It's always a conversation. So again, that's really a conversation between the customer's technical team and my technical team on what we can fulfill, in what way, and what they can live with. And there's a lot of considerations in that decision.
From a sales process, you're going to get to a point, if somebody's ordering a 10 gig, you probably don't have a capacity conversation, right? At 100 gig at this point, you're probably not having a capacity conversation. But at some point, you're getting to a point, right, where you have to have a capacity, and
Yeah, and by 400, we need 6. Yeah.
So what is that process like in the sales cycle, right? Somebody's talking to you and says, hey, I want this, whatever, right? And how long does it take to go through a capacity plan? How long does it, do you see before you're saying, oh, okay, great, no problem, we have this, we can do it, we can engineer it, we can, it's redundant, we know we can, have network health with this, and then at what point do you get into a conversation? It's like, okay, we can build this capacity for you, but it's going to take this much time because we have to touch these many boxes in between point A and point B.
It's all of those things.
Yeah.
And nobody's in a position where they can say, 10 gig, yes.
Yeah.
But when you're talking multiple 400 gigs across multiple, areas of the world, geographies of the world, we're doing just that. We put a business case together and we say, we're good here. We have to expand this here. We have to build here, and we go back to the customer with that, because you can't fake it. You either have it or you don't, and you can get creative and you can do alternate paths in some cases, but alternate routes, but that's not what they want, because you have to be diverse from this, or they have a certain latency that is going to be caused because you took a different path than what they had. So, it's definitely a conversation. And you just have to be as transparent as you can with customers, because nobody can do everything,
The other dynamic that I've seen play out a lot, this is, again, 2 decades worth, right? The slower circuits have less, I don't say consumption, less actual traffic flowing across it, right? So your average 10 gig circuit at this point, even if it's IP transit and they're doing like a 1 or 2 gig commit on a 10 gig circuit, that circuit probably isn't using more than 3 gig on average, right?
Especially in the enterprise space.
Exactly, right? But then when you get into the fast circuits, like those fast circuits aren't running at 10, 20, 30% capacity. Somebody that shows up and says, hey, I want to buy 400 gig from you, it's like, oh, you're going to use 400 gig for me.
9 times out of 10. Yeah.
Right.
No, and that all comes back to the planners and how you run your network, how hot you run your network, because we have to be, there's committed rates that they say, we'll commit to this, but we want to be able to burst to this, if you will. So you have to accommodate for not only the committed, you have to accommodate for the burst across the big. So it's not a simple conversation, but I would say when you're focused on doing one thing for 30 years, that's where that benefit, I say, comes in. It's not easy, but we don't have to worry about what's going on in the voice world or the SD-WAN device, or anything else. We really focus on that. And our planners are amazing. And we've got folks that have been with us for 15, 20, 30 years in some cases, and they really understand the network and how it works and what we can and can't do. So I put a lot of faith and reliance on the network teams, because they, anything we bring to the table, we say, this is a big build or this is a big opportunity. How do we address this? Well, a lot of times it's, we can do it this way. Go back to the customer and say, yes, we can do it this way. And they go, great. A lot of times we can do this way, but this other aspect we have to build or do something. I'll go a different direction, or I'm okay with that. I don't know if there's any secret sauce or anything to it. I don't know enough about the network planning, all the cycles they go through, but I'd put a ton of trust and faith in those guys. And again, it's all we do. So,
what do you wish people knew about Aurelion that they don't? Right now, I can give you a couple different leads into this, right? Because there's, like the old network guys like me have been in data centers for a long time that have known you for a really long time, right?
Yeah.
So there's like, what am I not thinking about, right? Like my audience. But then there's also the enterprise, right? Where the enterprise has not interacted with you probably ever or even know about you. Like, so outside of like just knowing you exist, right?
Yeah.
Like, what would you like, in very disparate audiences, what should people know about you?
Well, at the end of the day, I would say that we differentiate ourselves or solve three specific problems in the market, right? The first I've touched on quite a bit is network performance. We've never strayed from our knitting, what we do well for the past 30 years. We've not tried to be all things to all companies. We've been very focused on network, on connectivity, if you will. And so I think for me, having a ubiquitous, homegrown network spanning the globe is a definite differentiator, but it's not just talk. It's you see it in the network performance. The other thing that I see that we don't really get credit for or talk about is that we not only provide a great service, but the delivery experience is much better. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the conversations we have with enterprises and some wholesale companies tend to leverage multiple providers, enterprise one or two. Mm-hmm. And so they're terrified because the delivery experience they had getting to the point where they are was horrible. And there's a risk at making a change. But one of the things that makes us great is our delivery experience. And I wish more people knew about it. And a lot of my competitors will do they'll do a centralized delivery organization. They'll put it in Manila or in a lower cost country, and they'll work 24/7. Mm-hmm. But the challenge you have there is that the guys that deliver, they deliver and they see the green light and they say any problems after that, hand it off to customer service. And you're working with a support organization that is probably very good, but they were not part of the solution discussion. Mm-hmm. They don't know what's been delivered, and they're starting off, well, give me your circuit ID. Or, back to, and that's not where an enterprise needs to be when they're having a delivery challenge.
Right.
At Aurelion, first off, we have a globally distributed delivery team. So I have teams in all different time zones. They speak 26 different languages within that team. We understand the ecosystem, the customs, the time zone challenges, all those things. And usually the companies that we leverage for tail circuits and things are also customers.
Right.
So they've worked with the provider that's providing the tail. You know what I mean?
Right.
So we have such a better delivery experience than most because we're not all centralized. We're globally distributed. We're working in the time zone at the location where that IT team is. And then the second thing is that we hold on, our service delivery team is part of the solution design conversation. There's a handoff of knowledge, but they hold on to that delivery until it's working as advertised in the customer's environment. So they're not handing you off to some no-name in another country who's not been a part of the journey in the other 7 locations. We hold on to it. It's a huge differentiator because it's all fun and great when we sign the contract and everybody's excited,
Yeah.
But the real work starts in the delivery, and that's the first taste of a customer to your company.
Yeah.
And that delivery experience deters companies from making changes.
So what you're saying is you're a little different from the phone company, and if their experience has been working with the phone company, it's a little different.
It truly matters, and we recognize it's a risk, and we bring our delivery groups in on sales calls because that's a real concern of enterprises to say this is how we're different. And then finally, I think the third problem we solve is customer support. I know everybody says that, right? But you can measure it in very tangible ways. So for us, our net promoter score is 70. And that's one of the highest in the industry. And we get a lot of great comments about, the sales team is great, the engineering is this, the delivery was this. All the things I just said we're showing in our net promoter score. But the other thing we have is that we have a little less than 1% churn, of our customer base. So we've grown dramatically over the past few years in revenue. We've grown faster than anybody in the market, but we've grown, and I think part of that is because we don't have to worry about what's going out the back door.
Yeah.
Right? When you're not churning. Now, customers downsize and they change.
Yeah,
so
BK, acquisitions,
we count all of that as churn.
Yeah.
But we're still at a very low churn rate. So our customers typically stay with us for at least 3 or 4 term cycles. They don't leave us. They typically grow. And they say great things about us, our Net Promoter Score. So by any measurement stick, we're one of the best support companies in the business. So it's the network performance, it's the ability to deliver at a very high level, and then support those customers long term, to be a partner in the business, not just say, hey, we see the light, good luck to you, it's on your side. You know what I mean? I think those are things that I wish more knew about us, because we get a lot of open doors. We're doing very well, but I mean, there's, we don't sell to everybody. We sell to a subset of a subset.
Yeah.
If you don't have a global backbone, we're not that interesting to you, right? But if you're there, I think we're the best fit out there. I always say nobody's perfect, but we definitely do more right than we do wrong. And I'll put my company delivery, performance, and support against anybody in the industry.
As somebody that has a team of people just to help with implementation of client projects, I can tell you companies that go, my favorite one, right? It's like working with a data center, when you have an infrastructure in a data center, and then somebody will order a circuit from a LEC and be like, oh, we've ordered the circuit for the LEC, and the LEC's like, okay, we've installed it in the IMPO, and you're like, that does nothing for me because I need it in the data center.
Yes.
And then you're like, oh, well, this particular building has multiple data centers in it. Which data center controls the IMPO that the LEC is in?
Those a go-to.
And then how do you get, and like things that on the surface, you just have these moments where you're like, this is such a insane problem to be working with right now, and how much time and aggravation gets lost in those things. And so, just as like a practical example to what you say in terms of like having experience and working in these markets and understanding these things, like there is a big difference between a company that has experience working with data centers and carrier hotels and companies that don't. And also, how do you do capacity planning for people that, it's just completely different, right?
Yeah.
It's not apples to apples here.
No, and I think the enterprises, as they get more into AI and they look at more of the wholesale-like services to take on these big traffic loads, like an IP transit, like an EVPL, I think that's really where the rubber meets the road, right? I always joke, we never lose twice. We might lose once because, somebody bought the business, they went low ball and they made a financial decision, but the experience between the implementation, the ongoing support was terrible.
Yeah, were they able to install? I mean, talk about capacity planning. I was in a peer group a long time ago, and the host was asking people, what do you want different from us, right? And they were talking about specifically like interconnections and in carrier neutral facilities. And one of the network engineers that was there was like, I want an API to your system to request circuits and get an auto LOA and send that to the blah, 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 and get a cross connect to just turn this whole thing up instantaneously. And you're like, you can't, there's reasons why we can't do that for you.
Yeah.
Like I know you'd love just to be able to go out and be like, hey, I want to, at that time it was 10 gig, 100 gig hadn't rolled out yet. And, and like, of course you're like, that'd be great, Like, again, the promise of the cloud, like you can just instantly turn on.
Yes.
But like,
everybody wants to deal with a cloud company, but in our business, people have to physically move things
Yeah.
and touch things still.
yeah, you're like, no, somebody has to go there and plug stuff in, or somebody's digging a trench and putting stuff in the trench.
But to our earlier conversation, that's the attraction of a network as a service sort of value proposition. But anyway.
Look, I'm a technology maximalist. I believe that technology improves the human condition.
Agreed.
And the more that we get, the better off it is. And, it's worth the, boy, I'm going to get hate for this one, but like, nobody's complaining that we don't have people operating elevators anymore for us, right? Like, new buildings don't have buttons in elevators anymore, right? Like,
Right.
So the experience is better as a whole. And so I always love to see it. What I wish that we saw more of in technology wasn't this rush to pretend like we're marketing against, like what's the new hotness, right? But more like, how are we actually solving a problem? What do you need? Oh, well, we've decided that we need GPU capacity, right? Where's our data? Or our data's here. GPUs are going to be over here. How do we now make them talk to each other?
Yeah.
Why is this important to us? Oh, because we're doing this to, for our R&D, for data science, for revenue, for, like, oh, there's, like, what's the actual thing that you're trying to do? And you're like, okay, connectivity isn't that sexy on the surface, but then you're like, well, I mean, guess what? Like, this is the glue that holds businesses together.
Well, you bring up an interesting point. You mentioned API, and I think that, yes, that's kind of the nature of our world these days, right? It is how can I have that cloud experience, right? But you also have a new breed of decision makers who that's how they want to deal with it. They want to deal with an app. They want to deal with text. They want to, they don't want to talk to somebody or have a meeting with someone. And so, I mean, one of the things that we're pushing is a lot of self-service in our portal, but it goes beyond just, oh, you can put a trouble ticket in, or you can do this BGP testing, and you can do this physical, test or whatever. It's definitely a toolkit for diagnostic, but it's also, we're rolling out other tools. And so what I mean by that specifically is, we have an internal tool, but we're going to be exposing it to our customers, that you can go in and it has all of our network map on it. You can go in and look at our network map and say, I want to buy a wave from this point to this point, and I want it to be this capacity. I want this, I want that. You can actually do that, and you can download that and send it in to us and say, price this out. Right. Well, we're evolving that to where if you have a price book with us, you can get the price, and you can actually go in and reserve that capacity. Now, you'll have to sign the contract within a certain, it doesn't hold for ad nauseum, forever. But we are looking to say, how can we automate not only the service portion of the portal, but also the network, exploring what can and can be provisioned. And then we also, when you reserve that capacity, we give you a delivery time. And some, if it's an existing, can be, a matter of a week or two.
That's awesome.
And if it's not, we say, nope, we have to go back and do this or do that. But we're looking to do as much self-service, not just on the support side, but also on the sales side, so we can streamline those conversations to get down to, I built this network, I just need you to price it, and how fast can you deliver?
I feel like you've been holding out on me here. This is actually a really interesting thing to talk about, right? Because now, there's a side of that which is great, and there's a side of that that's bad, right? Because now you start talking about, like, people don't know what they don't know, and if there's not, like, any sort of, like, thought process in some, like, loops, like, oh, people can dig themselves into holes without realizing that they've dug themselves into a hole. Because
the idea of it isn't to automate the human touch and the knowledge out of it. The idea is to lower the friction of doing business with companies and say, if we can give you some tools where you can play around a bit and build something you think is interesting, the next step is let's validate all this with a solution engineer.
Right.
To your point, because you may be making some fundamental mistakes based on the rest of your network or your traffic pattern or your application environment or your cloud. You know what I mean? But it's to lower. We want companies to say, it was so easy to work with these guys. And part of that conversation is giving them a toolkit and giving them the ability to go and design some stuff their own, to where they're not locked into talking to somebody if they don't want to. There's a lot of smart IT people in the world, and they just need the ability to.
I had no idea you guys were offering this. We gotta yell at people here.
It's not commercially available today, but it's absolutely the direction. But if you go to our website today and you go into our interactive map, you can go highlight a region, and you'll get all the POPs and all the POP addresses on our in our network. And you can download those and use however you want to. We have a map you can download. You can download it in an Excel or a CSV file or whatever you want to. That's the first iteration of it. So we're going to be expanding on that sort of, you can go back to a region. I want to do Europe. You can get all the POPs in a certain region, and then we're going to say you can go and build a wave or build, certain services there.
So let's go really basic here. We'll keep it with Ethernet. We won't talk about, like, waves and optical. Just say Ethernet. And you have two core products in Ethernet. You have some sort of private connection, call it whatever you want to call it, and then you've got an internet connection, right? Call it whatever you want to call it. Different people have different terms, trade terms. Like traditional, you'd order an internet circuit. You say, I want this capacity, I want this kind of contract on it. You get a port into your network, right? Like, boom, we connect now an internet circuit. Or I say I want a private connection, same thing. I go through a provisioning process and we get a port. Assuming that it's connecting to the same gear on your side, right? Like, one does one thing, one does the other thing. Part of, network as a service, part of what you see these like NAS products are really doing is just being able to deliver multiple service types on a single physical port.
We can do that. If you look at our website, we're already there.
Okay.
We can have one port, multi-service, single port is what we call it. So we already do that today.
So within that, then you start talking about provisioning and provisioning capacity across your network. If I've got a port in it here and a port there, and you're doing your cloud on ramp, you've got this all integrated. So I can say I want this capacity to this region of this cloud provider, and I want it delivered on this .1Q tag in this market, and boom, just turn on.
Yes.
You guys are bearing the lead on this stuff.
Yeah, you always have to. Things move so fast. You always have to validate that capacity is available. You always have to validate the card inventory is there. All those things.
Of course.
So yes, but these are things that we've been doing for a while. So I think it's well known in the wholesale space, not so much in the enterprise space.
Yeah, I would say probably not known at all. Because I think this is the core promise of a lot of what you see as like upstart NAS companies. And really it's like that flexibility is like product service delivery, and then contractual flexibility, right? You can go to a NAS company and you can say, I want to buy, consumption-based utilization across your network.
Well,
right?
Today, a lot of the functionality is internal, but where that translates is we have a quick install time, faster provisioning, all those kind of things. But the goal is to expose more of that to the end user community in a controlled way. When you start putting pricing out there, it gets a bit dicey.
Of course.
What you do. So how do you ring fence that to where existing customers can see their price book, or versus somebody coming in from the internet or whatever.
Yeah.
So we're not completely launched in all that today, but the first iteration of that is out on Interactive Map, and we'll continue to launch over the next year. There's a roadmap. So the goal is to, like I said, reduce the friction. And if people want to buy from us directly and make a phone call, we'll do that. If they want to buy through the channel, we're great with that. Go through the channel. If they want to buy and they go and they want to do it all online, we're great with that too.
I appreciate the complexity of this, right? I don't think people really understand. You've got 1,000+ devices on your network that you have to manage and orchestrate,
easily,
right?
Yeah.
And then when you start saying like, okay, not only you have 1,000+ devices on your network, you've got, an order of magnitude more network interfaces on your network. And then you've got, BGP, you've got internal routing protocols, you've got cloud connectivity requirements that come from the different providers. That's a very complex, configuration set. And now you're like, on top of that, we want to have some sort of automated API-based delivery, process that goes into orchestration that has like appropriate guardrails on it that doesn't like break something. Like, whoops, So I'm like old school in the sense that like my priority is like, don't break anything for me.
Yeah.
First and foremost,
Yeah.
I will tolerate like having to interact with humans in exchange for not having stuff break.
Yeah.
Right. But but it's like, thinking back again, like going back 20 years to like now, and like what's available, not just from like the performance, but like this conversation, like my brain's like, oh, I can solve that problem here and here and here now.
Yeah. Well, again, I'll take it back to where we don't do everything.
Yeah.
We do a few things really well. And we've done it for a very, big audience in the wholesale space. But now as AI is permeating more than just, wholesale, and hyperscalers are engaging with more than just, carriers and big companies are all over the place. We definitely want to stand out a bit and shine and say, look, we're here. And these are things. This is why we're here today doing these podcasts, to get the word out there.
Okay. So parting words, right? We're at an enterprise.
Oh, are we recording? I didn't know we were.
Yeah. So parting words here. I do it sneakily, so that way we can just kind of walk in. 30-second elevator pitch. We are in an elevator at a conference together, and it's like, oh, hey, what do you do, right? And not a wholesaler, not an air carrier customer, I'm not a hyperscaler, right? Like, I represent like a large mid-market enterprise, right? Fortune 1000. What's your response to that?
I kind of already did it, but I'll do it again. So Aurelion is one of the largest connectivity providers in the world globally. We really solve three main problems, whether it's wholesale and enterprise. We specialize in global network performance. We've always stayed true to our knitting. A lot of my competitors have tried to be experts at SD-WAN and security and voice, and what they've done is really dilute their value proposition, where they're experts at nothing. We really have stayed close to just providing connectivity services on a global scale. As a result, we have the best network, the highest performing network, and the amazing reach that we manage day in, day out. It's our main course of business. And we feel that's been served us well, especially in the days of now we're seeing AI volumes drive and cloud volumes and all the different things that are happening in the ecosystem. We're in a very good spot. But secondly, it's really about that delivery experience. My competitors have a centralized delivery, organization, typically not in the country where they're based for cost reasons. Because that you get somebody that sees a green light come on, or they think it's installed and they say any problems go to customer service. That's not a great experience. Mm-hmm. Conversely, Aurelion's got a globally distributed delivery force. They're all over the world. They understand the languages. They understand the cultures, the players involved. Those companies that are providing those tail circuits or anything else are typically our customers. So we have a very different relationship with the people providing services as part of the solution than a lot of my competitors, and they're on the ground. They work in the time zones that your offices and data centers are in. There's a tremendous value of that. But most importantly, they hold on to that delivery experience until it's up and running as designed in the customer's environment. We might pull in some engineers, we might pull in some support people to help us, but you're never going to be tossed off to another organization who doesn't understand the solution or it's been delivered thus far. And then finally, it's about the support. Delivery and support are the two biggest things why customers leave. Cost is always in there. Yep. But delivery experience, they don't forget about that. And support, it's constant. By any measurement stick, Aurelion provides one of the best support experiences in the business, be it Net Promoter Score, be it our low churn numbers, the fact of what our customers say about us. They continue to grow, and our just growth as a company. We're growing faster than anybody in the business. I think we do it right. I always say we do more right than we do wrong. We're not perfect. Nobody is, but in terms of global network performance, having an amazing delivery experience, and being really responsive and supportive along that journey, I think that puts us in a different position than most of my competitors today.
Amazing. Thank you very much for the time.
Hey, sure.
I had so much fun. This was fantastic.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of Signed. If you got something out of this, share it with someone in your world who's staring down a tech decision. A CIO, a CFO, a founder, a procurement lead, whoever. That's how the show grows. Everything from today lives at itbroker.com/podcast. Show notes, transcript, links to anything we mentioned. If you're in the middle of a real tech decision right now and you want someone in your corner without the vendor bias, that's what we do at itbroker.com. Schedule a call on our website. Buy tech without regret. I'm Max Clark. Thanks for listening. See you on the next one.